Michael Kennedy is professor of sociology and international studies at Brown University since 2009. He was at Michigan for over 20 years before going to Brown, and during that time he served as the U of M's first vice provost for international affairs, in addition to being director of the International Institute and 5 centers and programs at the U of M, including CREASE. He was also the Howard R. Swearer, is that how you say that? Director of the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. Throughout his career, Michael Kennedy has addressed intellectuals and professionals in Eastern European social movements, national identification, and systemic change. And his first two monographs were based on the Polish case. But in the last 15 years, he's also studied the sociology of public knowledge, global transformations, and cultural politics, focusing on energy security, universities, and social movements in the EU, but even more broadly than the EU, throughout the world. His most recent book, here, Globalizing Knowledge, Intellectuals, Universities, and Publics and Transformation, was published recently this fall by Stanford University Press. Today's talk draws on that book, but is tailored specifically for us, as Michael will speak about globalizing knowledge with Michigan, Polish, Kosovar, and Ukrainian accents. So please join me in welcoming Michael Kennedy. Yes.
I'll be able to. So thank you so much, Genevieve. And let's see, we'll put it into slideshow. And whenever I have an introduction, I always try to think of something cute, right, to say after people give a nice commentary. But I don't have to say anything cute. I can say something heartfelt, and that is that the greatest distinction I think I have is to have you all as my enduring friends and colleagues. So that's the simple way to start. And I'll try to talk with my Michigan accent in this, because that might be the thing that's coming back to me most quickly. I had dinner with my daughter last evening at Zingerman's Roadhouse. This is product placement. Zingerman's Roadhouse. And this was the first time I ever experienced the notion that I was coming to the Midwest, because I always previously felt like I was coming back. And at last, this feels like somehow I've become a New Englander. But I still can't park the car anywhere that ought to be parked. So let me talk about this book a little bit, but to do the thing that I'm trying to do wherever I go. Because globalizing knowledge is intended not to be a final statement on anything, but an invitation to conversation everywhere. And you'll see why. So, in fact, I gave my first book talk, if I can say, in Singapore. And one of my former students and enduring colleagues, Hiro Saito, was there. And those of you who know me, he actually turned the tables and he started diagramming how I was making this book work. And I diagram everything, but I never thought to diagram my book. And he diagrammed it, and I realized, the short statement that I have in the book about what I care about, and that is who is intellectually responsible and why, is actually not my abiding question. This is my abiding question, pompous as it sounds and long as it is. But it is so heartfelt and so enduring that I'm able to think about this conversation wherever I go. How do intellectuals mobilize institutions and networks to engage issues in a more globally responsible fashion? So that animates the book, but you won't find the sentence there because it's figured out subsequent. But obviously, that doesn't make for a very good talk. So I have a very simple and brief pair of questions that I would like to share with you today and ask you to help me think through. That is, first of all, I will be curious after you all read the book whether you can see my accents. And in fact, when you do, you'll see so many people's names mentioned, so many stories recalled. I think someone actually said, I never knew you could do an ethnography of intellectuals in a kitchen, right? But in fact, those things happen, obviously, because we don't just live in the classroom. But there is a very serious question underlying, and that is, obviously, our accents shape how we look at the world and how we globalize knowledge. And one of the things that distresses me is that every university, if we're thinking about those, every university tries to compete with one another on the same hierarchy, to climb the same ladder, without recognizing sufficiently their distinctions and building on those with an eye toward how we might contribute public goods to the world, rather than improve our relative status to others. And given that these accents are inevitable, why don't we turn them into assets rather than things that simply make the story interesting? So for those of you who have not read the book yet, which I think is all of you, this is how I define globalizing knowledge and turn it into a sociology. The thing I want to encourage you to take from this, though, is the idea that globalizing knowledge is necessarily and ultimately relational, right? Anytime you're globalizing knowledge, you're globalizing it selectively. You're looking at particular places in the world, particular themes in the world, and you're doing it from the foundation of an already existing argument or set of issues or set of concerns. So the idea that somehow we're globalizing is profoundly misleading, because we can easily think about degrees of globalization, but in fact that's the wrong conception. There are different forms of globalization. And I would like to take that further today with you, but just to give you a sense of how the book is organized, there's, some people might say too many books in one, but I'm trying to give you a bargain. But these are the kinds of questions I ask and answer provisionally in each chapter. How knowledge matters. In fact, responsibility is one of my abiding themes, especially with work I did with Ron many years ago. The legitimations chapter is mainly about universities, and in particular, what legitimates the university to have its status. In particular, I'm very concerned for my alma mater and the alma mater of others in this room. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is now suffering an ideological assault on its integrity. And I think this is something that every academic across the world needs to pay attention to. One of the things I picked up from being at University of Michigan is that publics matter. They don't matter everywhere in many universities. It's not just because University of Michigan is a public university. It is also because University of Michigan has a tradition of public engagement that it, I would say, and I would humbly propose, it does not sufficiently recognize from within. But once you leave, you see what a great job it has done. Difference, that's the chapter I'll talk about at length today. Connectivity is about flows. And in fact, the substance of that chapter is mainly about energy, and especially the relationship between Europe and Eurasia, Russia and Europe, in terms of energy flows. And Muge's nodding because she remembers when we went to Finland, and we're trying to work with the Finns on this. And in fact, we did work with the Finns on this very nicely. And in fact, Natasha, I think, was the one who actually put this seed in my head, because one day she came to me and said, you know, the Austrian ambassador said that energy is going to be a really important thing. What year was that? It's like in the last century. So clearly there is a, so when each of you read this, you will see the Michigan accents in it, because I can't just say it's only about Michigan because nobody else would buy it. But you will all see from Michigan just how important it is. Design is something that I insufficiently appreciated, even though we have this fine School of Art and Design, even though I wouldn't say it's only thanks to Marisha, but substantially thanks to Marisha, I wound up developing relationships with the School of Art and Design when I was in administrative responsibility, and I came to appreciate it then, but I didn't appreciate it sufficiently, and now I'm beginning to, in part for something I'll refer to later. Then the last chapter is really a historical one, a history of the present, thinking about the crisis in which we're living today and how to represent and how to recognize those intellectuals and social movements and knowledge networks that might be making a difference. So obviously we can talk about all that today. And here's the diagram that Hiro helped me figure out. And obviously we're not going to talk about all that today either. But it gives you a sense, for those of you who don't know me very well, how I think, which is not very linear. But this conceptual map to the book I use as the foundation for every talk I give, and then think about, well, what parts of that book would be most applicable to the place where I'm talking? And so here, this is the conceptual map for today. I would like to begin with design, actually, and talk about a book that's forthcoming that ought to change how we think about university governance, university mission. Second, I'd like to talk about the recognition and distinction that the University of Michigan has and what it enables, not only for the state of Michigan, but for the world. Think about the importance of articulation in all of this, but with a little bit of reflexivity. So that's the map. And here's the first thing. How do you design for recognition when you're thinking about internationalizing a university or even globalizing knowledge? I have come to know this fellow named John C. Lee Brown through our common membership on the Social Science Research Council's board. I wouldn't have met him otherwise. He's a computer scientist, but more appropriately, an intellectual of uncommon sort. He doesn't wind up, trying to impress us with the length of his bibliography, but he often impresses us with the profundity of his simple points. And you're going to see that here in this book that is forthcoming called Design Unbound, that he wrote with Ann Pendleton Julian. After all, if you think about what design is as an intellectuality or even as a mentality, you'll see something that could be inspiring and would lead us all into more design ways of thinking. It is always visionary. It is always optimistic. In fact, when I was speaking with Agata earlier, I was recalling my first time in Poland in 83, 84, and how oddly I felt because, when Poles identify with each other, they engage in a little bit of narzekania, right? And which means they complain to one another, right? That shows that you are actually close to the person because you can complain to that person. And I never could get close to anybody because I never wanted to complain because I was always optimistic. The glass was always half full. But design is also, because it's also about how do you bring new things to the world, not looking at the clutter, but how to get rid of the clutter so you can bring something new. That's an optimistic disposition. But it's also something not just for the TV shows designed for this. It's really a way of thinking about how ideas can matter. And it's changed the way in which I have thought about my own work in profound ways. I haven't yet thought it through, so it's only a gesture in the book. But it's a gesture because I need to be a little more skeptical in my optimism. Because sometimes I think I'm a little bit too optimistic, which leaves me to dangers of naivete. And certainly that is characteristic of the world that was made after communism's collapse. If we had a little bit more skeptical optimism about the character of the world, I think we would not be watching the invasion and destruction of Ukraine by Putin. But one of the things that we need to do is to think about how to translate this notion of skeptical optimism associated with design away from its principal association with material objects and technology, and think about the ways in which even institutions might themselves be thought of as these objects that create new opportunities for visionary change. And I would propose to you in this very building that the International Institute was just that thing. David William Cohen, the founder of the International Institute, is in the room today. And I'm really pleased with that because, in fact, one of the things that I think it's hard to do from within is to ever sufficiently appreciate the innovation that has come from within. But in fact, the International Institute has enabled a kind of creativity and innovation at the University of Michigan that I don't see elsewhere. And I know it's challenging in these budgetary times. But one of the things that I intend to do, not just with this talk, but with the kinds of writing that I do, is to help people understand why the University of Michigan remains something to emulate, but also something in which to invest, especially its International Institute. I am asked to go to lots of different places and advise about, how do you internationalize? And they say, well, what about Michigan? I said, yeah, if you could. Because it's not easy to be a Wolverine. And when you step outside the Go Blue bubble, one of the things that's actually quite remarkable is about how good Michigan is, right? I don't know if any of you in the room, but you should carry around this cheat sheet, probably the president does, right? Is where, in what fields is Michigan in the top 10? Look at these. Graduate rankings. I won't say it out loud. But in all of these areas, Michigan is in the top 10 in the country. And it's in the top 10 in other areas as well. I noticed that U.S. News and World Report doesn't report on graduate programs in anthropology, for example. Clearly, anthropology is in the top 10 at the here at the University of Michigan. So this is one thing in which Michigan is great. But here's a little question, a little test for you, all you true blue Wolverines. What is the only area in the world, in world rankings, where Michigan is in the top 10? Polish studies, probably, Yeah, that's right. Pani ma rację. So probably this would not be a surprise in social studies and public health. Why? Because we are great across the board in social sciences, and the links to public health are obvious. And is it any surprise that the International Institute really represents that combination powerfully? So for some reason, oh, there we go. So if you go to other kinds of indicators, this QS indicator, which a lot of international students and faculty use, Michigan is number 30 in the world. Unfortunately, area studies, Michigan doesn't show up. And that's because it's linked to geography. And we got rid of geography thanks to some insightful actors in the early 1980s. Really unfortunate. International studies is linked to political science. And because we have an excellent political science department here at Michigan, we are ranked number 30 behind all these other people, all these other schools. But everyone who looks at these rankings knows that they are problematic, right? And everyone always talks about them as saying, well, if you do well on it, you always say, well, of course I don't respect it, but we are very good in whatever happens to be recognized. So they are socially real. A sociologist would certainly talk about these rankings as meaningful indicators somehow, even if not truthful indicators, right? But what does it enable? And I just want to be self-indulgent for a second. Because when I come back here, I am constantly reminded of how I came and how I left. Because when I came here, I was just a sociologist with interest in Poland. But the quality of this place enabled me to become so much more. It was like the best postdoc for 23 years I could have ever had. I began as an assistant professor with some affiliation with CREES and some affiliation with this thing called CSST, which was this interdisciplinary association initially of anthropologists, historians, and sociologists that deserves its own institutional history for the consequence it has realized. But then I wound up by accident, and someday I'll tell you over beer how that happened, directing CREES in particular, but also CSST, and I was a community member in the International Institute. I remember David, well, I better not tell that story. And then directing the International Institute, then joining the Provost's office as Vice Provost for International Affairs. And that was all too rapid an ascent for me, because I kept on breathing fast, sprinting almost across these things. But the thing that I want to suggest about this is that it has enabled me to see the virtue and the distinction of the University of Michigan, and the reason why I constantly celebrate it as a model of the public university for these reasons. One is that it is terrific social science across the board, but very significantly, because of its strength across the professions, and Stephen Whiting is here with whom I worked, it's not just social sciences and professions, unless you think about the School of Music as, I remember we have this beautiful thing in part because of Stephen Whiting's influence back in the day. But in most other places, when I talk about international studies, it's the political scientists and the historians who call the tune. It's really good to have someone with musical sense in the room to call the tune. And not just musical sense, but a far broader intellectuality than typically happens around international studies. Second thing is that Michigan is really unusual. There are only like 5 other universities in the world, probably with the kind of depth of area studies expertise that Michigan has in so many different world regions. And if you just stay within your world region, you don't necessarily appreciate it, especially if you don't have an international institute. But because we had an international institute, the folks who work in Southeast Asia, the first folks who work in Southeast Europe, the folks who work in Iceland, well, there aren't so many here, but do have the opportunity to work together. And this is what creates a very different kind of atmosphere for the University of Michigan, especially since those who try to imitate Michigan without that area studies depth wound up talking in global terms all the time. We are talking about security, development, governance at the Watson Institute, and that's great. That's an important theme. But if you don't mark the accents with which development, security, and governance are spoken, then you're actually hiding some of the agendas that are in fact at work, and I'll talk about that. The reason why area studies could take off so well here at Michigan was that the institution had a commitment to diversity. It valued the challenge and opportunity of difference. We often think about diversity in domestic terms and area studies as the international expression. But in fact, this is profoundly misleading, and one of the things that the University of Michigan already does well in thinking about how those can inform one another and perhaps how they ought to inform one another better. So let me actually take that theme of diversity and difference and share with you some aspects of my book in Chapter 5 and show you that although I am a qualitative sociologist, I can count. And I counted the relative attention to places in different knowledge cultures between 2002 and 2009. I counted a lot of other things, actually. But I looked at 20 or 30 journals in each field, in anthropology, in international relations, and in sociology, and searched for when either the noun France or the adjective French ever appeared in a journal, and ranked them. And, I'm sure this could be done in a much more sophisticated quantitative fashion. But one of the things that this enabled me to see, and I don't think anyone has done this before, is that there is a systematic inequality of attention to places in the world, right? We know this, but we never mark it in a way that can be as compelling as it ought to be. And of course, one of the things that's interesting is to see that, of course, France and Germany wind up being especially prominent in IR and sociology. Germany, not so much in anthropology, but still there, right? So we can look at those top places. In fact, the movement of India in anthropology, this is a relatively recent ascent. And it's not surprising for the ways in which it's not just Indian area studies, but also subaltern studies and post-colonial studies have become so important in anthropology more generally that even if you're not talking about India, if you're talking about Brazil, you might mention India because of the ways in which Partha Chatterjee's work might have informed, right? But look at the lower levels there. It is astonishing to me how recurrently Ukraine is underattended, right? So this becomes part of the story I'll tell later. The second thing, I wound up focusing in particular in that chapter on Afghanistan, Kosovar, and Poland. Afghanistan, despite the fact that we have been involved in a war there, longest war ever for the United States, despite that fact, Afghanistan winds up being radically underattended. And we can talk about why. What shocked me, actually, was how underattended Kosovo was. We can talk about why. And Poland was something I had focused on earlier, not surprisingly, and I'll talk about that in a second. But notice the difference here. It looks like IR is the responsible one. Why? Well, it's because IR as a field doesn't necessarily have to develop any contextual expertise in order to be able to talk about a place. So long as it's important for the foreign policy of the government, they'll start talking about it, right? They have theories that allow them, whether it's realism or constructivism or whatever you would like to call it, it allows them to talk about a place without necessarily knowing what a blood feud is or whether it continues to exist, and so on and so on. So I talk about that in the book a bit. I take out some of the cheaper shots. But what I would like to do now is to say why it is that particular places deserve more attention, because I think one of the reasons why, if I can call myself, and I don't deserve to call myself a Ukrainianist, but I could call myself a Ukrainian sympathizer, why it is that these places don't wind up becoming as prominent as they ought to in larger comparative and international discussions. Why? And I think if we develop a social science of this, and meet their responsibilities. So, obviously, when I survey them next, Ukraine is going to be like up at the number 1 or number 2 position, right? Because everyone can now talk. One of my favorite Facebook entries recently was by one of our Ukrainian colleagues. I can't remember his name right now. He said, look for these things to see whether this is something worth reading. And they said, has this person ever written on Ukraine before, for example, right? You know, and so on and so on. Well, I don't want to be so cheap as that, but I think that was a good essay. But here are the things in the book that I talk about. In fact, as I was finishing the book, Maidan was happening. And I didn't really, in the book, intend to talk so much about Ukraine, even though since 1993 I've been focusing on it. And in fact, Asya was trying to help me get ready, I think, for going to Ukraine in 1993 when we had this exchange with Lviv. And Oksana was already there, sort of like making sure that I would be taken care of. And so, you know, so it was like, it was a really important time to remember that the University of Michigan was so invested in Ukraine. But the rest of the world wasn't, if they didn't already have Ukrainians there. So what is it that enables those without Ukrainian background necessarily to take care of a place, to be interested in a place, to be invested? Well, Maidan certainly provided that. Not so much in the beginning. In fact, Tim Snyder just came to the Watson Institute last week and gave this fantastic presentation. I asked why he moved from being this sort of like conventional historian of the region to becoming one of the leading public intellectuals talking about the region. He says, because there was a vacuum. Because there weren't enough non-Ukrainians speaking about what was happening in Ukraine in November, December, and January, that I didn't have a choice. I had to. So that's available online, and it's worth reading, or worth watching. But that was easy. I think talking about the general significance to what followed with the invasion of Crimea, and especially I'm happy to see Greta here, and University of Michigan is especially fortunate to have someone expert on Crimea, because it's unbelievable to me how easily that has been overlooked for the ways in which that not only violates a sense of history, but also throws the meaning of the world order on its head. But we have not come anywhere close to thinking about the way in which that Russian invasion has redefined war, peace, and international law. And, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there is a sociological foundation to a kind of conspiracy. And that is, so many people who have an invested interest in the way in which the world is want to diminish the significance of what Russia has done in Ukraine. And so there is actually an alliance I have seen among those who are used to détente in the past, because they feel like we need détente again. And I actually suggest in the book that we might compare those who thought about détente first in the Cold War and those who might have thought about the solidarity movement of 1980-81 first during the Cold War, with how their positions are today. Because if we were to think only about the stability of the world, we might be able to forgive every atrocity being committed in Ukraine today. However, if we want to think about how the world could be made better, I don't know how we can think about that without putting Ukraine to the center of the conversation. And that means rethinking what war, peace, and international law mean. And that has gone so far for me, as I have never been someone to consort with military experts, even though my brother is one. And that's true. And now he and I are actually writing together to try to think about what do we need to think about in terms of the military's role today in assuring peace and stability. But beyond all of these things, I think Ukraine's example illustrates for me the importance of putting back on the table this very quaint notion of intellectual responsibility. And Tim Snyder is one of those people who exemplifies this for me. And in fact, I'm going in April to American University to talk about intellectual responsibility. And I'm going to read much more about the debates on Ukraine as a case in which we might think about how to recognize intellectual responsibility when we see it, and how do we recognize ideological interventions when we see it. This is not just about Ukraine, it's about the importance of university work generally. So Ukraine, for me, has become central to the abiding questions of the future of the world, simply put. I don't have the area studies expertise that I need to be able to do this. And I'm recognizing that. But the people who come to the University of Michigan to develop that and develop it in tandem with these general approaches to the character of the world have that opportunity. And I would love to see University of Michigan be central to that. Second, Kosovar. I didn't develop my commitment to Kosovar while I was here, even though Donna will recall we had this great event on NATO in, I think, 1999, and the way in which this was playing out. But I was primarily interested in Poland for the longest time, and of course, like everyone, I was concerned for what the wars of Yugoslav succession meant, but I had no connection to Kosovar just about at all, apart from one graduate student, Besnik Pula, who came later. And thanks to the Open Society Foundation, I wound up going and advising at University of Pristina for about 5 years, thinking about how we can make a better social science in Pristina. And I came to understand much better some of the challenges of thinking about Kosovo and the meanings of peace, war, democracy, sovereignty, and justice. The same themes, actually, we should be thinking about in Ukraine. And we occasionally have those comparisons made. But somehow, we don't quite have the way in which to compare them appropriately. Because after all, Kosovo did end an era. When NATO bombed Serbia, that really did end the innocence of transition culture because it became explicitly geopolitical and no longer an illusion of modernization. But as soon as that happened, Kosovo effectively disappeared from global recognition again. It was like a hit and miss kind of area studies project. And in fact, this feels to me even worse, in part because the contextual expertise that might allow us to understand the struggles in Kosovo today, especially around this picture, is just so underrepresented in universities across North America. In fact, one of the themes of the book is to try to explain why. Why is it that expertise on Kosovo is so limited? So you guys can all recognize the man because I think his name is below his statue, Bill Clinton. All right, I don't think there's no statue of Monica Lewinsky there or anything. So it's like it is a clear focus on Bill Clinton's role in protecting against genocide. But for those of you who easily know what it says in back, don't say. Do the rest of you know what that says written on the walls? So no negotiation you can probably figure out because yo means no, right, in Albanian. But anybody know what Ventivadosia is? This is criminal. Because Ventivadosia is one of the most interesting and innovative social movements in the world that I've ever seen. It is also a political force in Kosovo's parliament, and it has potentially transformed Kosovo because it won't let corruption go. I'm not a paid consultant of Ventivadosia, so this is not a corrupt statement. But Ventivadosia is one of those movements that is continually hammering on the question of corruption in Kosovo. Not only among Kosovars, but also about the European Union stewards that remain there. And what do we know about Ventivadosia? Oh, they're nationalists. That's how they are simply explained. Why? Well, partly in their name. It means self-determination. Now, this is all set up to why Poland is central in the world. It is partly because they have great graphic arts. And that is no joke, right? It is true. Because if you only have good music, well, they do. If you only have good theater, oh, well, they do. They had a great film. Oh, just won the Oscar, right? I mean, so there are a lot of reasons why we could say Poland is central in the world, and it has to do in part with the arts. Because the world recognizes Polish high culture. But Poles are exceptionally good at translating high culture into popular culture and political struggle. Not only for domestic audiences, but for global audiences too. So in 1994, I thought I should try to explain why I became so fascinated when I went to the Polish Sociological Association meetings and I gave a talk there on the Polish sociological imagination in America, or how American sociologists thought about Poland. And actually, there's a systematic social science story there. It isn't just because of solidarity, although everyone in my generation was drawn to Poland because of the solidarity movement of 1980-81. And those younger than I were drawn to Poland because of the fall of communism, beginning there with the Round Table, especially if they were here in 1999 visiting our conference. Genevieve was here, I think, still as a graduate student from the University of Chicago. So, so Poland has done enough cultural things and political things, but there are these underlying things that made Poland familiar. Back in the socialist period, when all those social scientists wanted to compare socialism and capitalism, where did they go? Well, Poland. Why? Because they most resembled us Americans. Why? Because they had great social science. They were relatively open. And we could talk to them about status and inequality in ways that we couldn't talk just about anywhere else. Maybe a little bit in Hungary, right? Maybe a little bit in Yugoslavia, but Poland was clearly one of the best places. Secondly, Poland kept on coming up in the sociological literature as being central. Even in world systems theory, where was the first periphery of the world system? Poland, the breadbasket, right? But there's also this very subtle thing. How many people know this name Florian Znaniecki? Everybody should. Why? Because he was president of the American Sociological Association in 1951. That's not the only reason, though, right? He co-authored with a guy named W.I. Thomas one of the most important books in the history of American sociology, The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, which helped give us this concept of unfortunately called the W.I. Thomas theorem. If you define things as real, they are real in their consequence. Poles will understand that more than anybody else. So there are all these things that contribute to making Poland much more important in the American sociological imagination than you would imagine otherwise. But when you think about it, you could actually think about, well, is there a way for us to replicate that model to make Ukraine as central, to make Afghanistan as central, to make Kosovo as central? What are the ingredients that you might incorporate in order to do that? So, one of the things I would conclude with is by first of all saying we need to develop knowledge network capacities. The capacities to develop knowledge networks today are so fundamentally different than when I was beginning my career, simply because of the ICT revolution, the information communication technological revolution. But we have, unfortunately, a much more limited imagination about that possibility than we ought. And I think we can develop it much more effectively. Chapter 7 of my book is devoted to knowledge networks. we should much more seriously think about what the challenges of recognition are. It's not just whether you can identify where Ukraine is or where Mariupol is, right? It is about recognizing the difference between truthful information and propagandistic information. Now, that sounds like a simple categorical distinction, but it remains a relevant one, especially if universities are going to do their job properly. It also means that we need to go beyond these global frames, because these global frames are often mechanisms by which we diminish our capacity to recognize those who are not as powerful as we are in America, those who are not as rich as we are in America, those who do not speak English like we do. So that's why Michigan becomes this terrific place to reinvent, one might say, a responsible approach to globalizing knowledge, one that puts difference to the center of these global themes, and maybe even to translate those global themes into languages and allow those translations to come back to reformulate those global themes. For example, this one, za wolność waszą I naszą, right? Every Polish speaker will know that means for your freedom and ours. Are there any Albanian speakers in the room that would help me pronounce the second one? No, there ought to be. And the third one, I know, I actually use Google Translate. How should it be? And why is it like this one? This is good, a little bit Google Translate-y. So this is why you can't trust Google Translate. And I would love to say that that's why I made the mistake. So let's conclude. And I'm putting this up there in part because I hoped Ron would be in the room, because he and I edited this collection, Intellectuals and the Articulation of the Nation. It came out in 1999. It was a reflection of the Center for Russian and East European Studies at that time, late 90s, in which we were thinking about the ways in which intellectuals make a difference. But one of the things that I took forward from that volume is the significance of the word articulation. Because I don't think of any other concept that is more important in a social scientific sense in the world today than articulation, both for the double meaning I have up there, but also for the ways in which it can invite us to think about the relationship between different cultural objects in the world today. And those cultural objects include the ways in which nations figure in conceptions of war and peace. But frankly, that book didn't sell nearly as much as Ron and I expected, so maybe after today it will. And the second conclusion is that we need to do this not only with a kind of attention to articulation. By the way, I wanted to originally title the book Globalizing Knowledge, Articulations of Globalizing Knowledge, but Stanford University Press said you'll never sell. So we did learn that lesson. So, and I would have liked to have had reflexivity in the title too, but that doesn't work either for broad sales. But I think it is really important for us to think about, not just as students and faculty members, as community members, but it's especially important for us to press our university leaders into this project. To think about that unconscious that's resting in the ways in which we're thinking about universities today. In particular, to think about how, when we articulate our global responsibility, which nations wind up sort of like figuring in. China is always there now. And it's not just because it's the size of the country. It's because of the size of the market. And it's not just because of the size of the market. It's the growing wealth of some of those potential donors. So let us be truthful about why some places become prominent in an academic administration and others not so much. But we need to be able to do that reflexivity with a much more rigorous, and I see Gary in the room, a philosopher's sense of what it means to be responsible. Not only for one's nation, but for the world in which one lives. And that's only possible, I frankly think, because of the power of nationalism in all of our institutions. It's only possible in a university of the world. And not only of me. That might be how I pronounce Michigan if I had a familiar Michigan accent. But it is one of those places in the world where globalizing knowledge could develop in ways that is unparalleled. At least it was the gift the University of Michigan gave to me, and I thank you very much.
So you will take questions,
I will take questions and run home with them.
but I have a special request. If you wouldn't mind standing up when you ask a question so that we can all hear you clearly. Thank you.
Because I am older than I was when I was here last. And my children say I don't pay attention even more still. So, okay. Are there any comments or questions? And I know everybody, but not everyone will know everybody, so if you would introduce yourself before. We more than met, but thank you.
Your talk has brought up so much that, where do I start? I feel like I want to respond to everything, but, I'll try to somehow channel it into two comments or questions. First, I'm all for globalizing knowledge and all that, but for almost 15 years I've been attending, Wednesday talks in this place. Now a bit less than I used to because of professional responsibilities. And I see that if there's a talk about, Russian literature, culture, history, most people who do Russian studies come, and some people who do Central European studies. But if there are talks on, Poland or Czech Republic or Hungary or something else, you can very rarely see people who do Russian. And this is not just, because people are bad and not interested, but this is about how disciplines are structured, right?
Yep.
So that's a reality. And then another thing about, bringing this former socialist world into the global imagination. This second world, and this is something that we in gender studies have been discussing for years. Well, it seems to us that, look, the experience that we have and the story that we can tell is so important for feminism globally, and it's not possible, really, for you either write about Western, about gender relations, or about the colonial world, but somehow the story from the second world does not fit anywhere. There's no framework for it, because it's not, this other to the Western thought and etc. It's something else, and there seems to be no way to trespass these boundaries. So that's my question, comment, reaction, or whatever.
So that is such a beautiful set of comments. I mean, just on the last one first, one of the things I recall from my days at Michigan, there was a project on globalizing feminisms in which there was Poland, China, India, and America as the principal bases. And of course, which was the country and whose representatives fit least well? Poland, right? And so actually part of the book is about thinking about globalizing knowledge and turning it more into variable form. So in that circumstance, one of the things I note that in globalizing feminisms, there's this really neat issue that feminists are actually often better than many other fields in connecting across the world, in part because their own home bases are less hospitable than are the global feminist currents. On the other hand, there is a hierarchy of global feminisms in which some are more feminist than others. And so marking that, as Second World Feminisms has done for a long time, is really powerful. But once again, one of the things that I was really struck by is that among my colleagues in Kosovar are people who work primarily in gender studies. And they are the ones who are often on the cutting edge of the ways in which they're internationalizing their institutions. But it strikes me as really unfortunate because their colleagues are often scholars who work in gender studies, not scholars who work also in international studies. Why? In fact, I learned more from them than talking to yet another sociologists like me. In fact, one was a sociologist, but she wasn't like me, right? So then the second point, though, is, even though Poland does relatively well in comparison to Afghanistan and Kosovar and Ukraine, the whole of our region does much worse than Bengal. Why? Somehow Bengal was able to capture the global imagination by talking about what the post-colonial is. And somehow we can talk about the global South. It's one of those terms that I can't stand because it assumes so much heterogeneity that it nevertheless is mobilizing and useful and powerful. So if we were to take those as examples and think about how we as people grounded in this region can talk effectively, and of course Catherine Verdery did a beautiful essay with Sharad Chari, I think, in comparative studies in society and history, comparing the post-colonial and the post-socialist. I saw this as one of the great interventions in this whole process, but we clearly need to invest more. But we're not going to invest more if there's not a disciplinary space to do this. And there is no disciplinary space to do this because area studies thinks internally. International studies is dominated by international relations scholars and political science. And we need to think about that alternative space. And what was that alternative space? The Program for the Comparative Study of Social Transformations. CSST actually created that very space, but it's gone. Is it gone? Yeah. It's gone, right? But there are alumni here who could imagine its 21st century expression. Asya, yeah, please.
Speaking of globalization, thank you. I'm a retired professor at UM. When you talk about globalization as a process, now, one way is to spread certain ideas is by listening to someone speak. Radio was one of the, today it's the internet. And as you know, I may be wrong, but I heard that in China today, they're trying to suppress the use of private internet. And of course, the one that comes to mind is Putin. What he is doing, globalizing his ideas through internet. And it's working. What is your idea of the best way to globalize?
Right. So this is where, I inhaled and breathed. I breathed and I even inhaled postmodernism, right? But one of the things that, the character of this world for me demands is a return to thinking about truthfulness, both in terms of intention and in terms of expression, but certainly in terms of giving us the capacity to do the ideology critique, the propaganda critique, and more than just contrasting truthfulness and falsity. Here is where, I know people deride him all the time, but Zizek is one of the people who helps us see, I think, fairly clearly the way in which ideology works. And it's not by putting out, suppressing truth in terms of falseness. It's actually by distracting us from what the real questions are. It's by distracting us from what the really important debates ought to be. And so one of the things that I was surprised by when Tim Snyder spoke, I can't remember if I asked him in private or in public or who asked him, but one of the things we obviously came to was a discussion about whether the West should arm Ukraine. And of course, last night, the United Kingdom announced that it's sending 52 or 25 or, 75, some huge number of military experts to advise Ukraine. Now, this is huge because it is changing the rules of the game, and that is important. But Snyder proposed that this was actually the wrong debate, that this is actually Putin's debate. Putin wants us to obsess about whether we're going to provide military arms to Ukraine because he knows that we're going to back off from that because we don't believe that Putin will ever stop. And so the question of intellectual responsibility for me comes in saying two things. both borrowing from Snyder. One is paying attention to events and figuring out how to cut through, if I can say this without offending anyone, how to cut through the crap that is overwhelming social media and the airwaves about fairly obvious things, like the downing of that airliner in July. Even more significantly, why is it that the United States cannot say Russia has invaded Ukraine? Why? Because if we, as a government, speak truthfully about this, that triggers all sorts of consequences that we don't want to take. But what is the cost of that? Putin's definition of truth, truthiness, in the words of Stephen Colbert, winds up becoming how we think. So that's the first point. And then the second point is that an exercise in intellectual responsibility means that we cannot allow ourselves to be distracted by the pseudo-debates, and we need to focus in on the real ones. But then the second thing that demands is for us to be able to articulate what are those things that we are really trying to defend. What institutions? And this is what Tim Snyder said. We should be not debating whether we're going to send arms to Ukraine or not. What is it that we're really trying to defend? And I think there's no good answer for that. We can say that we're going to defend our NATO allies if Ukraine ever, or if Putin ever invades Estonia, when he invades Estonia, right? We can say that but that's the wrong tripwire again. The real tripwire is what are those institutions globally that we're trying to preserve and why? I know Ron will have something to say.
American hegemony. That's what they're pushing. And Michael, I love you very much, but I am on the completely different side on this Ukrainian question, as you might imagine.
Yes.
That is, Tim Snyder is a public intellectual. He's no longer a critical intellectual. He's speaking for one empire against another. And I find that disturbing. And he's very influential. And in terms of globalizing knowledge, you'll forgive me for being nervous about this, because this is a very minority view in this country, not in Europe. In this particular era, globalizing knowledge means to me just what you say, but being sensitive to the other point of view and understanding why Russia and Putin is doing what it's doing. I am opposed to what he's doing, but I understand why he's doing it. And I think you have to understand why he's doing it. And this crisis, you may not like this, was begun by the West. We started this crisis. We sleepwalked into this movement, and he then panicked and took Crimea, and we're off and running into something like 1914. This is extremely dangerous. And Tim Snyder has not helped in this, it seems to me. We need to think very carefully about what Russia's geopolitical interests are and why he would take these extreme actions, and not exaggerate his ambitions. I think that guy wants to get out of there and doesn't know how to get out, and I'm not sure the West will let him get out. And Ukraine is the victim. I urge you to look at some other works, like the work of John Mearsheimer, like the work of Richard Sakwa, a very fine political scientist whose new book is coming out, and then weigh actually what's going on in this crisis, right? Putin is, a disaster, in my opinion, for Russia and for Ukraine, obviously. But there are reasons why he did what he did. I just wrote a book about the, Armenian genocide, in which I tried to understand why Turks committed genocide. I don't like that they committed genocide, killed my own grandparents, but I want to understand why he's doing it. That's what I think globalizing knowledge has to be about.
And I agree. And it's not just because I love Ron, too. But I think love is the foundation for having actually very serious intellectual disagreements and pursuing them on an institutional level. Because one of the things that is happening is that there is an increasing bifurcation in North American universities, in European politics, and so on. And, I hope we have a chance later to talk about this. But that is the point about this, about globalizing knowledge, is that we can't just focus on one set of issues, but at the same time, we can't simplify it by saying there's one point of view and another point of view, right? There are all these different shades of interpretation, and this is the university, to have that kind of debate. not just for universities, but to bring in all those folks where they can't talk in an atmosphere like this that this university can offer. Okay, well, we have to balance from one side of the room to the other side. And then, yes, Basha, yeah. You've never played that role.
If you were at a university in Poland, or if you were at a university in China, or Kosovar, or the Ukraine, how would you have written such a book, and how would it be different from what you wrote?
Oh, it would be completely different, right? So the first thing is, the major premise of the book is that we can't be ethnocentric, right? We can't be ethnocentric. But Americans are the most ethnocentric in the world, right? Why? Because we have so much diversity within America that we can pretend like we're global and cosmopolitan without ever leaving our city, right? So part of the book's critique is against American nationalism. Every other nation's nationalism is different because it's somehow oriented at least toward the United States, if not to other places as well. And just to, pick on, one place, I mean, if I were in Kiev-Mohyla University, one of the questions I would be wondering is whether I could have Ron Sunni come and give this talk. Because one of the challenges I see happening at Kiev-Mohyla and at all Ukrainian institutions is that this is not an intellectual debate. This is a debate of, life and death. And can they allow the same kind of dissenting voices, right? And so this is one of the things that I would love to be able to talk with Mikhail, who's my colleague at Kiev-Mohyla that has been writing so many good posts. Vinitsky, yeah. Mihailo Vinitsky, right? So when I get off here, I'll email Vinitsky to see. But this is like it's too difficult at some level, right? So, Kasha, yeah.
Lots of ways, it's related to what you said before about centrality, because those peripheries, such as the countries you've mentioned, the Baltics, Ukraine, Poland, all of the former countries behind the Iron Curtain, they don't matter. They are not central. So my suspicion is, in lots of ways, that's what's underneath a lot of this is the simple fact that the Western world, both in Europe and America, can pretty much prosper without the rest of the world, with coming back to the status quo before the Holocaust. And that's where my sort of problem with your perspective is coming from.
And just to sort of like provide the bridge for this as well, and one of the Watson Institute's board members and regular visitors is a fellow named Bob Legvold, who is a very prominent expert on Russian foreign policy and so on. And one of the things he said earlier in the crisis, which is very powerful, and you have to take this into account, is he said, listen, we need Russia in the world. He didn't quite say it more than Ukraine, but this is the implication. And he was, at that time, talking about Syria. He was talking about Iran. He was talking about all of these other potential flashpoints. And so one of the things that I really am frustrated by is that we do have our knowledge cultures segment debates In IR, there would be no question that Russia is more important than Ukraine, simply put. But that doesn't mean that somehow Ukraine's position cannot be elevated in those very debates about war and peace. Because it all depends upon how we interpret the actions of 2014. Whether it was, whether we take a Mearsheimer point of view and that Putin was pushed into it, or whether we take one of my favorite colleagues who writes for the American Interest. We know her well from SSRC days, from our Russian colleague. Lilia Shevtsova has written some of the most critical takes on Putin I have seen, right? And so much of it hinges upon our understanding these global dynamics. And we can't, I think, in rigorous social science terms, figure out whether it's, whether it's a Mearsheimer or Shevtsova interpretation. But we have to think about the implications of each of those interpretations for how we think about the global public good. And remember that somehow when we're figuring that out, Ukrainians are typically not in the room. And what does that reference in the politics of diversity on a global scale? Yes.
But we can also trace kind of structural determinants of local universities in different regions. How do they network with imperial, Russian or American one?
Right.
How do they discuss, for example, national or international knowledge and inline Stomka and Gura, which we discussed 2 years ago.
Right.
And how does it work on a very structural level of biographical trajectories of networking and all that? How does play a role here? And putting this local context and local academia into the discussion, now we're talking about Ukraine, and of course we know why it's happening, and you're interested in the region, and here lots of specialists in this particular area. But we can imagine dozens of places where conflict, social tensions are present, and it's impossible or hard to imagine a project of globalizing knowledge that covers all of them. So what would be kind of a very, very strict, very quick set of recommendations you could, for example, give for international institute, how to build effectively this kind of project of globalizing knowledge? How could it?
Right.
It's pretty difficult.
Yeah. I don't try to be utopian. I mean, and there's a sort of a matter-of-fact level in the book, and it's like, well, life is full of serendipity. And I just happened to fall into Poland, then I happened to fall in Ukraine, I happened to fall in Kosovo. I've never been to Afghanistan, but I thought that I should be talking about Afghanistan given its significance in the world. But I could be doing that in lots of other places. All I'm saying in that first example is we should be conscious of how we invest our individual careers and our university investments and not allow the instrumentalities of power and money to decide where we invest and why. And that then means rethinking the ways in which we think about hierarchies of influence. The fact that the University of Michigan has such an amazing Polish studies capacity, right? It's just, when I left here, I just thought, well, wait a minute. I'm supposed to have like 30 people on the faculty who are interested in Poland wherever I go. And it's just not true. Right? So if we were thinking about how is Poland to be represented in the world beyond Poland, well, it would make sense to invest ever more in the University of Michigan to build on distinction and not to invest in the University of Michigan in who can I offend? Something from the comic books, Latveria, which is Dr. Doom's home, the villain of the Fantastic Four. So we won't invest there. All right, but then there's the very serious problem and point. This ranking, these are all English language journals, right? Now, does that mean it's not significant? No. In fact, it's hugely significant. Why? Because these have the most prestige in the world. Because everyone who's not an English speaker has to be writing in English in order to gain recognition. And in fact, one of the things that's most interesting, and one of the values of talking about globalizing knowledge and not East Europeanizing knowledge, is that I get to go to elsewhere. And so having just come from Singapore in January, one of the things I see is that Singapore represents itself as the pinnacle of globalizing knowledge. But in fact, the way in which it's doing it is actually diminishing Singaporean place in its universities, because they globalize knowledge by recruiting faculty from abroad. And they give points for publishing in journals that are English language A-list, which winds up meaning that the scholars in Singapore shouldn't write about Singapore because the journals that are A-list aren't going to publish about Singapore. So ironically, globalizing knowledge in Singapore can wind up undermining the place of Singapore in the global imagination, unless you have someone like sociology graduate Daniel Goh, who is publishing in the A-list about Singapore, but of course is identified as a public intellectual and not just a sociologist. That's pretty good too, but that's not enough of an answer, but it is a comment. Herb.
Herbie, I was wondering whether you think kind of academic and intellectual networks function at all, let's say between Russia and Ukraine, or between Kosovar and Serbia. That was there a period, let's say immediately after the collapse of communism, when you would have had intellectuals across various disciplines, perhaps not agreeing, but at least debating one another? And does that get destroyed when sort of international politics brings us to the point of bloodshed? You know, like once blood is shed, these kind of dialogues become impossible. You kind of alluded to it when you said, you know, could you invite, or could the,
Vinitsky invite Ron.
So I'm wondering, is there still some
Do they pay well?
sensible
Not as well as Singapore.
across these borders, given that certainly my impression is that, you know, Serbian academics would have a different take on Kosovo than the people in Sweden, and
Yeah.
Russian academics would have a different
So,
take on what's going on in Ukraine.
absolutely. And so one of the things that I am interested in developing more, and I reference it to some degree in the book, are those projects that allow for intellectuals, artists, scholars from different places to retain those cross-national collaborations, especially when nations are at war. Feminists are the most likely. Artists are the most likely. Why? Because they are the last ones, well, maybe not the last, but they are among the last to be drawn up into the fury of war making, and are much more likely to be able to look at all of those other dimensions of suffering. In fact, one of the people I just want to mention who illustrated this for me here at the University of Michigan in 2001 was a colleague who's no longer with us named Glenda Dickerson, who developed a play called Kitchen Prayers. I don't know if you guys recall it, but it was an attempt to say, you know what, we are suffering right now after the bombings in New York and in Washington and the crash in Pennsylvania. But we are not the only ones to suffer global loss. And so they developed a play featuring only African American women to also highlight the fact that some voices are much more prominent in the description of loss than others. And the reason why I mention this is that this, for me, was a terrific example of how cross-cultural conversations can develop in much more profound ways than they typically do, because they threw off the script. They didn't allow us to rehearse our familiar responses, especially when we went to Turkey under Muge's guidance. And in that presentation, they were shocked, because in that presentation, they were identified as Americans who have no business talking about the Straits of the Bosphorus because they called it a river. And therefore, they were just as orientalizing as any guy who looked like me. They were furious. But in that moment, I saw the capacity for a kind of cross-cultural understanding that never would have taken place otherwise, because the Turks were saying, you should have stuck to talking about African-American history. Right? So, this is the kind of thing that universities ought to be able to do, is not just work out why Putin did as he did, but to think about those other conversations like the Armenian-Turkish dialogue that enabled us to think about the history of systematic oppression and destruction, and then allow the politics to emerge from it, but putting scholarship first.
One last question. Why don't we take two short questions and then we can wrap up?
Yes.
And that will be the end. So Val and Maria?
Thank you.
Well, strangely enough, I've been thinking about some things that intersect with what you're working on, and that's strange because I work on the 16th and 17th century. But I've been working on public intellectuals and university engagement in the witch hunts, where universities proudly stoked the flames by staking out a virtuous position. And you talked about being a glass half full kind of guy. I'm a glass half empty kind of person, but it seems to me we have pretty powerful examples of the dangers of publicly engaged universities. And actually, Ron's comment sort of brings this home, that if we're vehemently advocating a position that we think is right, those guys who were talking about the threat of the devil thought it was right and dangerous. Where does humility come into this, or how do we know that we're not doing harm anymore?
Actually, my question goes a little bit along with this. You're talking about how universities are internationalizing, and we all know that's true. And then many of us also collaborate in different places of the world. And a lot of what you're saying resonates, but it's kind of macro. So one thing I was thinking in my mind, what does it say for me as an individual, or for each of us in our personal collaborations with some of these intellectuals there, some of these universities? What recommendations do you have for us in evaluating how can we be globally responsible?
So those are perfect ways to conclude, because I would never want to be accused of hubris, but people often say I have a little. But it's always laced with a kind of, I'd like to say, a humility, because if I don't invite serious disagreement, then I don't feel like I'm saying anything meaningful. On the other hand, I'll use one example of a University of Michigan story about meaningful collaboration, and that was actually in the example of the psychology department here, when they were developing their collaborations with China. And this is one of the greatest illustrations for me of globalizing knowledge, because it didn't come with trying to figure out some big question. It came with saying, is there any kind of collaboration that we can do that will show us the limits of our own imagination? And one of the best ways for the psychologists to do this was to develop this collaboration with China that showed, in fact, that a lot of their models were based upon white middle-class students at the University of Michigan, and that Chinese perceptions could be different. And I tell this story a little bit in the book, but I felt like this was one of those things that the University of Michigan did that was profound. And that is that it really did de-ethnocentrize, if I can say that, the way in which psychology was practiced. And to this day, the Cognition and Culture program, for example, and other things here at the University of Michigan are spectacular in showing the value of this real individual difference and collaboration. On the public sociology side and the dangers of our hubris, I really am concerned for this in the following sense, that the models we have for public social science are not nearly as developed as they ought to be. And the ways in which we often retreat from them, one of the reasons we often retreat from those public commitments is because people tell us that we're biased. People tell us that we are activists. And in fact, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, one of the centers that's being closed today, a center that's dedicated to understanding better and dealing with policies concerning the poor of North Carolina, is being closed because they say the center director is an activist, not an analyst. And that example, for me, especially with the ways in which the university witchcraft story of yours come together, is that we, in the United States more than anywhere else, have retreated into a kind of domain of expertise that we need to be able to say, well, I'm only talking about this little small part of the conversation. And it's such a small part of the conversation that I'm not worried about impact because, it's just that 5 other people are going to read it, right? And this is where all of this discussion about the question of university value comes in. And so one of the reasons why I admire the University of Michigan is that it has made such a major investment in demonstrating the public value of this university. Mark Schlissel was just on the front pages of whatever the Go Blue publication is, talking about the value of the university for learning and the careers of its students and younger generations. But that's not the only thing. The greatest value of the university for me is to elevate the quality of the discussion in the country. And if we are going on witch hunts, it is the responsibility of other members of our community to say so and to create that opportunity for making sure that that is as rigorous a witch hunt as possible. I'm scared that I finished on that one, but it might be the best way to do it. So thank you very much.